short reading which Rupert has asked me to share.
A fox invites the stork to eat with him and provides soup in a bowl, which the fox can lap up easily. However, the stork cannot drink it with its beak. The stork then invites the fox to a meal, which is served in a narrow-necked vessel. It's easy for the stork to access, but impossible for the fox.
Okay, do we have sound? It's on? Okay. The meditation was an excellent choice. My wife actually sent that video to me 3 weeks ago. I tend to walk around with my nose in my phone. Something that disconnects us from the world around us. That's a real problem in my society. I remember as a little boy, people didn't have phones. Maybe I did it with books instead. Walk into polls. I never recognized anything around me. That's a disconnection. I'd like to tell you a story, my story. We'll just move that aside, shall we? When my deaf mother was not yet 18 years old and living in San Diego, she was disowned and evicted from the home by her own mother. She did this because my mother chose to attend a college for deaf people in Washington, D.C., rather than a university much closer to home. This exile imposed by my grandmother would have lifelong consequences for so many people. Somehow, largely because she was innocent to the ways of the world, she dropped out of college and ended up living just out of Denver within a deaf cult group. Yep, I said a cult. Its master was a deaf man who told his disciples that he was a guru, like God. His disciples worked long hours every single day, going around begging for donations. This is where I was born. For the next 6 months of my life, while my mother went out to beg, I was entrusted to the care of the guru's wife. Unfortunately, the moment my mother left for work, the cult leader's wife would walk out the back door with me in her arms to a small dingy shed about this wide, from me to the first row perhaps about this tall. Inside the shed were tall stacks of bags with cement mix in it. There was so much dust in that shed from the small holes in those bags. Well, why is that bad? Well, there was a filthy crib next to all those bags. I was left lying there on my back in that crib all day long until I was retrieved and cleaned up just before my mother would get home. The whole time I would be breathing in that cement dust and sat in my own excrement. After nearly 6 months of this constant abandonment, as my health progressively became worse, my mother finally wised up to my situation. And she found the courage to escape this group. My distraught mother stood up on the doorstep of my grandmother's house. I was in her arms. She asked my grandmother to help me. Why my grandmother? Well, you see, my grandmother was a grumpy grizzly bear who never had time for lovey-dovey nonsense. She raised 12 children all by herself. But this bear knew babies. In her long letter she wrote to me 20 years later, she said that the instant she saw me, she knew I was in trouble. She detailed how I was lethargic and presented with a runny nose and watery eyes. Because I was never picked up, my neck muscles were like soft rubber. I couldn't even turn my head while lying on my back. My eyes were constantly fixed on whichever hand my head was facing. I would steadily refuse to meet anybody's gaze, let alone hold eye contact for any length of time. In that cold and filthy shed, my hand with its moving fingers was my only friend, in a world of constant sameness and emptiness. Seeing me, my grandmother immediately felt such intense guilt and shame for her role in starting the chain reaction that led to this. She also knew that if she brought me to the hospital, I would be taken away by the Child Protective Services, and her daughter further punished for her negligence. What kind of life would I have then? My grandmother decided to mobilize the troops instead, her other 11 children. All of them worked together to provide constant care for me for the next 6 months. What does that mean? I was rarely put down and never left alone. By all accounts, I was bombarded with love. The duration of my eye contact became very fleeting, and then very slowly lengthened as my trust was earned. After 6 months with my extended family, my mother came back to get me, and stayed just long enough to satisfy my grandmother that she had learned the basics of how to care for me. Unfortunately, by then, it was known that my sickness included a severe ear infection. Left unchecked, it caused me to become deaf. My sickness also resulted in many years of physical therapy and adaptive physical education courses. My grandmother unwittingly left a legacy of abandonment, for which they tried to make up for the rest of their lives, until today. My mother, unfortunately, added 2 more children right after me, so she never had a chance to heal her wounds resulting from emotional abandonment during her own childhood. As a result, my siblings and I did not have an easy childhood. However, this vicious cycle ends with us. This determination to foster genuine connection with our own future children and those close to us is fueled by our familiarity with what is arguably the most painful experience for the social creatures that we human beings are. What's that? Isolation. What drives isolation? Separation. While writing this sermon, an epiphany came to me. My grandmother neglected my mother not because she had 11 other children, but because she was deaf. Although most deaf people's stories may not be as tragic as my story, this one is not unique in the deaf community. Most deaf people come to know the acute pain of separation. Let me explain. Most deaf children are born to hearing parents, where nobody knows sign language, and usually do not take the time to learn it, even after discovering the child's deafness. This means the burden is on the child to somehow communicate through a combination of any usable hearing, if there is any, lip reading. The problem with lip reading is only 30% of words are lip readable, are visible on the lips. And gestures or rudimentary signs. Things like sleep, eat, drink, drive. Needless to say, the child is almost always lost and in the dark. Because the deaf child often has no other alternative, the deaf child often seeks to understand in spite of these limitations. Such inquiries directed to the person with the most ability to communicate with the child are occasionally met with the most cursory summaries of the dialogue, and most often met with white lies, such as, "Oh, that wasn't really funny." "Oh, that's not important for you to know about." "Oh, I'll tell you about it later." And the child knows there will be no later. When questions are asked of the deaf child, they tend to be most superficial in nature. Most conversations are painfully brief, allowed to be interrupted, and remain unfinished. Such interactions become meaningless. These tendencies of hearing people are magnified when it comes to family holidays. When the deaf child has to interact with members of their extended family and answer the same questions over and over again. We eventually learn to amuse ourselves. But the holidays are usually not a joyful time for deaf people. There is a name for this nearly universal experience among deaf people. It is called the dinner table syndrome. Even though I was born to deaf parents and had full communication access in the home growing up, I finally experienced this myself as an adult. Here's what happened. My immediate family, who are all fluent signers, have relocated away from San Diego for various reasons. So I was the last one there. Naturally, I continued to attend our large family reunions hosted by one of my aunts or uncles. One day it hit me full force that I was experiencing the dinner table syndrome, that it was happening to me. Unlike a child who cannot comprehend what is going on and blames himself or herself, I understood what was happening, and it had nothing to do with me. Even though I knew this realization that most members of my extended family would treat me like that was so painful, I had to take a walk. I walked and cried. I could not imagine the pain of living a whole childhood of that. No wonder my mother is so estranged from her family. After that particular reunion, I continued to attend those reunions. But now I drive myself, connect with all those whom I love, then I leave. I do not linger. Deaf children do not have that luxury. I'm seeing various emotions in this audience, so I will stop right now and say this before going on. I believe that most all of those hearing family members, including my relatives, meant well and do not comprehend the pain that they caused in those seemingly fleeting moments of separation. Interestingly enough, I believe that these human tendencies of hearing people contributed in part to the creation of this intense bond that all culturally deaf people share. This bond transcends everything else, race, religion, whatever. Deaf people are typically much more quick to become close friends and are typically also slow to trust those outside this close-knit community, namely hearing people. Deaf people have adapted to this isolation and forged their own social network so that they will never be abandoned again. Because we know the feeling of separation is so painful that we would do whatever is required to transcend this. The discovery and inclusion of oneself within this deaf community, which often happens as an adult in a college with many deaf people, like RIT, is an extremely healing experience for many deaf people who came from a lifetime of separation. As a result of this, it creates a powerful sense of clan-like pride. Many deaf people would prefer to remain within this community for the rest of their lives. Their identity as a disabled person has been transcended and morphed into what is a primarily cultural identity. It is awe-inspiring how far one would go to maintain contact with other human beings. That said, it is interesting that nowadays most people in our society report feeling lonely. 20 years ago, people had an average of 5 people in their lives that they could talk to about things that matter to them. 5 people. Now the average is 1. This means that many people are saying 0. Perhaps people in the general society, outside the deaf community, are starting to glimpse the pain of this separation that we deaf people are very familiar with. None of us are immune to this pain. That is an inconvenient truth. Every one of us has experienced it at various times in our lives. When was the last time you felt some kind of separation between yourself and other human beings? Perhaps you found yourself struggling with depression that you can't seem to overcome. Perhaps you found yourself at the short end of the stick and bearing the brunt of environmental pollution. Perhaps you struggle with the separation between yourselves and migrant workers. Perhaps you found yourself yearning for a chance to meditate in a scene of pristine wilderness. Whatever your experience is, why is that experience of isolation and separation so vivid and painful for you? Maybe because we are social creatures, and we crave, demand, and need human connection to flourish and thrive. This made me wonder, is there a greater pain than separation? I'm not sure there is. Think of all that separates us. War, greed, lust, and marginalization of any minority group all comes from this sense of separation, right? We UUs are often asked to think about what we are doing individually and as a people to help heal that spiritual disconnection that we experience every day. I love this concept, but it also trips me up sometimes. I got to thinking further and stumbled onto another big question. Ultimately, who is responsible for making it right, this separation? Is it me, the one who is being separated? Or is this the responsibility of the person who makes me feel separate? All of these questions led me to two different models. The first model is the medical model, wherein the disability itself is the focus, to the exclusion of the whole person. With deaf people, doctors operating within this framework focus on fitting people with hearing aids or offering cochlear implantation. The focus is on fixing the problem. The second model is the social model, wherein the disabled person is a person first, to be seen holistically. That person just happens to have a disability. Here's the tricky part. Because according to this model, it is the society that made the person disabled. How? Well, an example of this would be when a hearing person refuses to exchange handwritten notes with a deaf person. That hearing person is disabling the deaf person. Or here's how the model works in reverse. Imagine a society of mostly deaf people who always talk with their hands moving so fast. And then there's a hearing person who does not know sign language walking in. Who then is the disabled person in that situation? Or yet, here's another way to think about it. Let's go back to the Greek fable with the fox and the stork that was read just before I got up here. Were either the fox or the stork disabled? No. The circumstances. They had anatomically incompatible dishware. That's what disabled them. So that's the social model. Are you with me? Good. Friends, it occurred to me that our Unitarian Universalist faith is calling us to follow the social model in working with people less privileged than us. It is what our hearts and our conscience is telling us to do. The only way to heal this spiritual disconnection, this separation, is for those doing the separating to step up to the plate and say, this is my work. This is my calling. I want my life focused on getting people to be seen, not overlooked. Once people know they have been seen, that they matter, that we are not accommodating them out of pity, compassion, or empathy, but because we believe in the fundamental necessity and the intrinsic value of us all being connected. Friends, this is our work. As an example from First Unitarian, I am bursting with pride for the baby we have birthed last year. This baby is the Deaf Inclusion Ministry. This baby is still an infant, but it is something to breathe life into and gently care for, as a way to mend for all the wrongs from the past. We at First Unitarian are the first in the whole denomination to have taken this work to this level. It is the right thing to do. Come and work side by side with me in bridging this separation, this gap between us and those less privileged than us. Come, step up to the plate. Because this status quo is a painful thing for our community. Come join me in undertaking projects no other would dare take on. If not you, then who? Now, I know this is not easy, and that is okay. It is okay to admit that sometimes succumbing to separation is, well, easier. That sometimes it takes more work than we are always willing to give, and that it is mucky, hard work. And yes, undoubtedly we will slip and embarrass ourselves at one point or another. But think about what we will have created. We will have begun to create a world that is inclusive of us all. And friends, that is indeed heaven on earth. May we together live up to this noble calling, to offer this connection to one another. And then we can indeed bow to one another with full understanding of the meaning behind the ancient Sanskrit saying, Namaste. The spirit within me salutes the spirit in you. May it be so. Amen. Thank you very much for having me.
Join us for worship every Sunday at 10 a.m. at the Unitarian Universalist Church of Canandaigua, a welcoming congregation. We are located at 3024 Cooley Road, 4 miles west of South Main Street, Canandaigua, just north of the intersection with routes 5 and 20. Look for the blue signs just before the turn. Your comments about this program or questions about the church are welcome at 585-396-1370 or at our website, www.canandaiguauu.org. Producer and editor, Daniel Brigham.